I'm Selena from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester, and I'm here with Sue Miller, who is an author of contemporary fiction and nonfiction. And she's here and she's going to answer a number of questions for me. And first of all, I'd like you to briefly tell me a little bit about yourself and your writing.
I've been a writer, I think, really in some sense or another all my life. I mean, I did write as a little kid, and in high school I won the National Scholastic Award for a short story that I did. I guess I was 14 or 15 then. And I stopped pretty much while I was in college because I was supposed to be doing other things, actually. I did take one writing class my senior year. But then I started to write again, and I just wrote all the time around sort of things I was working on, and I mean, jobs I had. And then probably less after I have one son who's now in his 50s, but I think for the years around when he was little, I didn't write all that much. And then I started to again. I was divorced. I was a single mom for about 14 years or so. Anyway, so that's just all I've done with my life. It's the only thing I'm really very good at. And I'm sort of just preoccupied with it. Happiest when I'm doing it, actually. Very unhappy when I'm not, but it takes a while to sort of get unhappy enough to make me start again. That's what happens to me.
I was reading an old interview that they had with you, someone had with you, and they were saying that you were very self-conscious, or you were very, not self-conscious, but you were very not what's the word?
Sneaky, shy.
You were very shy about it. That you weren't confident.
Yeah, I just didn't send anything out for a very long time in my life. I hadn't really thought of it when I started writing as anything that would, as producing anything that would get published. That wasn't the point of it for me.
Yeah.
And, which gave me a lot of time to get better, which I needed. So that when I did publish, the book seemed infinitely more polished than my first two stabs at writing. So.
That's great. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about your latest book.
Well, it's called Monogamy, and it's really sort of, in some sense or another, about that question in the life of the main couple who are presented in the book, a married couple, a long marriage, and sort of very different kinds of people. The husband, Graham, owns a bookstore, and he loves working in the bookstore because it involves so many people. He likes to have people around him. He loves people. And in a certain way, he works very hard at sort of having people love him. And his wife, Annie, is very different from him. She's much more self-contained, maybe shyer. And she's a photographer. And her work is very important to her, but she's never really broken through to a sort of big success. She's had periods in her life when her photographs have been taken by museums and so forth. But there's a way in which she sort of is on the fringes of success most of the time. So when the book starts, she's about to have her first solo show in a lot of years, I think 5 or 6. And he has launched himself into an affair, not the first affair he's had in his marriage, but there haven't been all that many. And he's remorseful and regretful and distracted by trying to figure out what he should do about it. And that's how you meet them, essentially, in those two positions vis-a-vis each other, each a little distracted and drawn away from the other for various reasons. And it traces through, it gets larger as it goes on, the book, and you meet more of the characters. You meet their children. He has one child by a previous marriage, and then they have together, Annie and Graham, have a daughter. And the older child, Lucas, who was Graham's by his first wife, whose name is Frida, is now an adult and married himself and so forth. Sarah, the daughter, is living in San Francisco, is single. And then you sort of know more and more about their lives as you go on. So it's sort of an expanding circle of people. In addition, there are friends. There's an elderly neighbor next door who's really part of things, and her cat, who is very much part of things too, as it turns out. So it sort of encompasses a sort of neighborhood and a life that they live together, a joint life. And then it's also about each of their separate sort of agonies and foibles and things like that. But it's very much about their marriage, essentially, what it means to each of them together, which is it's very important to both of them in very different ways, and what it means to each of them separately, apart also.
And what was your inspiration for this book?
I sort of talked about it in an introduction to the reader's copy, but I wrote, my nonfiction book that I wrote was about my dad, who died from the sort of side effects of Alzheimer's disease. And he was ill for quite a while, and he was fundamentally in my care. And I was just so grief-stricken after he died. And I had loved him very dearly, and he was a gentle and sweet and kind and erudite man. And it just seemed the bitterest irony that he should die of a disease that took his mind away from him, essentially. He was an historian, which is a further irony, I guess. So I wrote a book that took me about 10 years to write, in between a bunch of novels, about him and a lot about Alzheimer's disease, which I didn't know very much about clinically when I started out, but I learned more and more about, just as the world was learning more and more about it. I was writing it through the 90s when a foreign country that had just been discovered. I mean, they were really finding out a lot of things that they hadn't known about the brain during those 10 years. So every time I stopped, I had to start again to find out all the research that I needed to catch up on. But while I was writing it, I had a lot of sort of documents. I had some of his letters. He destroyed his letters to my mother before he died, but I had a lot of personal letters. And I had sort of commentary. I talked to a lot of his friends and read a lot about him, actually, and really felt I was in communication with him somehow, that I felt that he had come back to me in some way, and I understood him in a different way from the way I had before. And I understood myself vis-a-vis him in our relationship differently. And I wanted to really write about that experience after grief, or along with grief, of being in touch, sort of reaching across that barrier between the living and the dead, and feeling somehow in communication with someone who's gone. And I certainly didn't want to write about myself and my father in that regard. I felt I'd done that book in nonfiction. So I just sort of thought I'd invent this, and I started off with Annie, and then sort of was figuring out how close she would be, and then how they would fall apart, essentially, in addition to his dying, which happens in the book, which is not giving too much away. It happens about a third of the way through the book. And then she gets very angry at him because she finds out that he's been unfaithful. And so that she's doubly separated from him. She's separated from him by grief, which is in a way staying in touch with him. Her sorrow keeps her that way. And then she's really separated by him because it just cuts through her grief and doesn't allow her to think fondly of him, and sort of takes away her sureness of their relationship. I mean, what was real in it, what wasn't real, those kinds of things. And I wanted her then to sort of work her way back to him, which is the course of the novel, essentially, along with a lot of other characters who have their relationships with Graham, and you sort of look at the way he's affected the lives of a bunch of people. But the main story is Annie, really, in Annie and Graham. So it was that sort of sense of oddly, in our thought, of reaching across somehow, of understanding someone better and differently after they've died.
Oh, wow. It sounds like you really are more of a character writer than a plot writer, if you know what I mean.
I think that's true. I mean, although I've written a couple of very, very plot-driven novels. I mean, I think my first novel, which was called The Good Mother, was probably the most plot-driven. And I think that was I had written a couple of unpublished novels before then that had no plot at all. They were just like these little sketches, essentially. And I realized I needed to figure out how to make a plot and how to have that be at the center. And it's a very plotted book. I mean, at the center of The Good Mother, is a courtroom drama with all of the, the examination and cross-examination and so forth. So it sort of feels a little over plotted to me in some ways. But, and then, there's a murder in another one of my books. So there's been, to varying degrees, a stronger or a sort of more diminished plot. But this book and several others, certainly more of them than not, I think have been just tracing through, the way people connect to each other, what they make of each other, how they change each other, and trying to really make the reader feel that they understand this person, that they know this person. And even, it's my hope that they sort of understand the way my various characters fail. Also, I'm interested in that. So.
Oh, wow. It looks as though the video in sync and audio are not quite in sync. But that's I think it'll be okay.
Okay. I don't think there's anything I can do about it.
There's nothing that we can do. Yeah, unfortunately. Okay, and which character in your book do you love the most or hate the most?
I don't hate any.
In Monogamy.
No.
You don't hate any of your characters?
I'm just very interested in them. So, even the murderer that I had in an earlier book, I sort of wanted to understand why he did it. And I think I made it very clear what was going on in his mind. Not that it's excusable, but that is something I'm interested in, is to present people who do wrong things or hard things that are hard for a reader to accept, and to try to persuade the reader to try to inhabit that character, to understand that character well enough to understand why he might have done or she might have done something.
Mm-hmm. That's a job. That's a job of a good writer.
Yes, it's an interesting job, I have to say.
Yeah. Now, what are your connections with New England? I mean, how important has New England been? New England setting been to your writing?
Oh, the setting has been incredibly important. And I think it's because New England itself is important. My family is basically from New England, both sides of my family, and just goes back and back and back, mostly in New England. My father got his first job in the Midwest. He's an academic, was an academic. And so he got his first job in Minnesota at Macalester College, and then he came to the University of Chicago, which is why I grew up in Chicago. But always that we'd gone to my grandparents in the summer, which was in Maine. My grandmother grew up in Maine. She'd been a librarian, and my grandfather partially grew up in Maine too. And they had my great-grandfather, who was head of the Bangor Theological Seminary for, I think, about 20 years, had bought this very primitive place on a lake near Bangor, Maine. And it had no electricity, no running water, no telephone. You couldn't even get there. I mean, the first person had to walk around the lake and get a rowboat out of the outbuilding and put it in the water and row across and get the family left on the other side of the shore. And so it was a very unfancy place, to say the least. But we all went there, my cousins, and there were a couple of academics in that family, my cousins, my uncles, essentially. And so they had summers off, which was a delight for me. So I felt always sort of, I didn't quite know where I belonged. Was I a Chicagoan, but Chicago seemed kind of alien to me in some ways. Or was I someone, was I an Easterner? Was I a Maine girl? It was a very complex, I think, and divided loyalty that I had. But certainly New England was incredibly dear to me in a way that, particularly my grandmother was the center of that. My own mother was really difficult, and my grandmother was sort of the maternal force in my life. She was funny and sweet and sort of taught us lots of womanly things, to cook, to knit, to things like that. And so I was very torn always. And then I ended up coming to school in New England and just staying. I mean, I went away for 1 year, I think, essentially. Very boring. But I do love it. I mean, I feel very at home here, I think.
Great. What kind of research went into writing this book? I know that you had mentioned, I know that it has a lot to do with photography.
I did do, yeah, because Annie's a photographer, and I was very interested in finding out about photography. I mean, I've always been interested in photography, which is part of why I made her a photographer. But I went to a lot of shows at the MFA over the years that I was writing the book. And also there was a wonderful Sally Mann show up at the Peabody, in Peabody, that I went to. And I have a friend who's a photographer, and she was willing to just sit and talk with me a lot about her life in photography, and also the way taking photographs has changed over the years, because of the change in the technically the change, the ability to work digitally. And I signed up for one of these master classes online with Annie Leibovitz. And yeah, they're interesting classes. I mean, you're just listening to her talk and watching her work, but it was really helpful to me to watch that, because I could watch her digitally correct things and make things look very, very different as she was thinking about the way she wanted the final picture to look. So they've just, it's just, and it was great, great fun to be the subject of some research. The bookstore thing I didn't really need to do very much about, since I kind of live there in bookstores. And I'd actually, for an earlier book, also had a bookseller and had worked in a book. Some very kind people had let me work for a few days in their bookstore, but I really did basically nothing. I did sell one book. That was good. But I sort of got used to the way of being in a bookstore, sort of a little bit, and watched how much of the work is not about books, but is about keeping the books and trying to stay afloat and trying to figure out how not to get stuck with a lot of, just sort of being careful about what you order and how many and things like that, which are interesting to me too. So those were the main things that I did research on for this book, actually.
Oh, great. What's your favorite part of being a writer and on the whole writing and publishing process? And what do you think has been your greatest lesson in the journey so far?
Well, my favorite part is actually writing when it's going well. There are many times when it's not going well, and then I sometimes get just into despair, actually. And actually for this book, I had a long false start to it, which was very hard, probably about 100, 125 pages or so at the beginning that just didn't work. So that was hard, that was difficult. But when it's going well, I really love it. And I write longhand, and so it's a very sort of comfortable and untechnical way of writing. So I just sit in a chair and write, and that feels I feel at home doing that, essentially. I've had great luck in the sort of publishing part of my life, in the sense that I didn't publish anything until I was I think I was 43 when my first book came out. And so I was just writing before that. I wasn't publishing. I published a few short stories before the book came out, but that was very, very close in time to when the first book came out too. But I got my first agent very easily. She saw a short story that I wrote, was published in a local literary magazine called Plowshares, a very good magazine. And she got me my publisher, and my publisher was wonderful. It was at Harper and Row years and years and years ago, and just a great editor that I had there. He died. He retired first, but he's dead now. I always think of him so fondly. He was just a great, wonderful person and a terrific editor. And so I've been very lucky, I think. It was a little bit fraught, this particular book, in terms of the publishing of it, because I was pretty sure I was leaving the publisher I'd had for a while, which was Knopf. And I didn't know if anyone else would be interested in me. And I also left my agent. So as I finished the book, I think maybe that's partly why I sort of got a little long, because I didn't want to face this sort of job ahead of me, which was to find an agent and to then probably find a publisher after that. It just seemed like, jumping off a cliff, essentially, when I finished the book and sort of said, okay, now my job is, sort of as though I were at the very beginning of my career. Now my job is to find my way to get this book published. And it worked out, but it was just, I was frightened of it at the time. So, as I think I would have been if that's the way I had started out, just trying to find, I felt sort of the world opened to me by chance and by accident, because I got my agent way back in 1985 or whenever it was, 84. And this time I just didn't know if that would happen again.
You felt like you were starting over again?
I did. I didn't really have a publisher and I didn't have an agent, and I needed to find those two things, which is the way it is for people, when they finish their first novel. They sort of have to say, okay, well, now where should I send this? Who should I, what should I say in the letter that I write? That kind of thing. And, I think I was also at an age where I wasn't sure, there are many wonderful young writers, and I think there are people who are just interested in young and more experimental, young writers who are doing more experimental forms of fiction, essentially. And I actually was turned down by a couple of possible agents who just felt they weren't so interested in my kind of fiction, essentially. They were interested in more.
Interesting. So what is your the greatest lesson you've learned so far in your whole writing career?
Well, I think it probably is just that it's hard and it takes a long time. It takes me a long time anyway. And also to, I think to make scenes, essentially. I think that's my strength, that's my gift, is to have things happen in a sort of dramatic way. The books themselves aren't highly dramatic. There's not, sort of cataclysmic things happening, and there are no great mysteries, usually, that kind of thing. But to make convincing scenes with dialogue and to enter characters, essentially, that's the goal for me, and that's the hardest thing for me too.
Mm-hmm.
Through their paces, as it were.
Okay. Question: when you're writing, what does your desk look like? Are there things that you need to have with you, like food or an animal? A lot of times people have furry critters with them that they need to have with them. And do you prefer music or silence?
I prefer silence. My desk is a mess, but I don't often write at my desk. I write in, my desk is over here, but I'm not going to let you look at it. But I write in notebooks. This is, let me get this. They're just these notebooks full of words, and I can carry them anywhere I want to in the house. So they're like this. That's my first draft. And it's usually like 4 or 5 notebooks that make a first draft, essentially. Then I type that in. So, I don't work in my office all that much. I do typing in and I printing out and that sort of stuff. And I like silence. I couldn't possibly listen to music, because then I'd be listening to music. And that's a whole separate thing for me. And I love it, but I don't do it while I'm writing, just as I don't I love wine, but I don't drink it while I'm writing. But my study is looks out over the street. It's a quiet street, but that actually means maybe that you kind of, when people walk by talking, you're more interested in that than you should be. You know, you can hear them because it is such a quiet street. But occasionally it's very noisy, something, you know, there'll be guys blowing leaves, things like that. And you just sort of despair of getting anything done. But I write in longhand and I love that. I mean, that's sort of part of the pleasure of it for me, I think, is it doesn't feel, it feels sort of provisional and easy. And I sort of begin with a sort of sketching out of things, and then it just gets fuller and fuller. And then as I'm writing, I'll sort of remember, oh, way back then, I could use that thing that I gave up on, you know. And so there are lines telling me to go back to page, you know, in my notebook, page 200, and there's that scene and so forth. So then I sort of spend a lot of time arranging things, rearranging them, pulling them around, that sort of thing. But it just feels to me much more fluid than, and there's something definitive about typing something onto the page. It looks like a book. It looks finished, and that's, I like to feel this can all change. I can make this better and better. It doesn't have to be this, you know, and just maintain and hold on to that sense of being in it, creating it, you know, still being in process.
Do you do a lot of revisions?
Oh yeah.
Do you do that on your computer, or do you do it more on your notebook?
I type in what I've done and try to, and then sort of have to sort of move around in the notebooks and get this passage from here, and sort of, so I have an approximate chapter, let's say. And then I revise that by writing in longhand over what's there. Sometimes with arrows that go around to the back of the page, so that it just, you know, it just sometimes blows up to be twice the size it was. And then I type that in. This is an immense waste of paper, is what I do. Then I pull that out, print that out. And I probably use, you know, just thousands of sheets of paper for a book that in this case is about 350 pages. So there's, it's not the most efficient way of working, but it's a way of working that just works very, very well for me. And I just feel very relaxed in the way I'm doing things.
Yeah, I mean, everyone has their own favorite way to do it, you know. I mean, it's sometimes I know I like to write in a notebook. Sometimes I use the computer. A lot of writers use Scrivener. I don't know
even what it is.
That's a program that allows you to just do all kinds of stuff. Oh. It's amazing what it allows you to do.
I'm not going to try it at my age. I don't.
It's so confusing.
Yeah, but I would just be so out of it. But anyway, it works for me what I do, which is
exactly.
Very, you know, just very Luddite, really, essentially. So.
Exactly. So, what are some of your passions when you're not writing?
Well, they have been. We've moved a lot, and I love sort of architecture and design and so forth. So I really have. My husband said at one point that I have never seen a wall that I didn't think would be better somewhere else. So I really like to renovate, I guess is the thing to say, although I'm tired of it. And I like to garden a lot. And then basically I just like to read books and sit across from people and talk about books and have some. I miss this enormously in the pandemic. I mean, especially, you know, I was still doing this in my backyard or other people's backyards, having some wine sitting around and just talking. And that's one of just the greatest pleasures, it seems to me, in life. And I just can't wait for it to warm up a bit so we can do it again, or to get my vaccination so we can do it again. Yeah.
Exactly. So what's been your favorite adventure during your writing career? Or do you have a really great adventure?
I don't. I mean, it just was wonderful for the first to go out on tour, which I don't, you know, I doubt that will happen in the same way. It certainly hasn't happened for this book that way. No. I mean, I've been virtual, and I think it seems to me that what I was gathering from my publisher and other people who are in publishing, is they have discovered that that's actually just so much easier way for the books to sell. And they just thought it would be death. And it hasn't been death. I mean, it's been, fiction has done very well. Other books have done very, very well. It's been an amazing kind of revelation, I think, that you don't have to go out and, get in a plane that morning and then go someplace the next day and the next day and the next day. But the first time I did that, it was fun. It was really fun to do. And then it just got to be less and less fun and more kind of exhausting, just the amount of travel. And so I think that was just a great adventure, and I just enjoyed it.
Great.
I liked it at first, just seeing new places and looking around these different towns I'd never been to, and it was great.
Yep. That's great. And you're not too far from Annie's, so yeah.
Right.
So you can come and visit us sometime.
Yeah, I'm pretty stuck on a couple of really wonderful bookstores near me here that I can just walk to, which is great.
Yeah.
Cambridge used to have, as I recount in my book, it used to have many more bookstores than it has now.
That is true. That is true. Although there are a lot more independent bookstores coming up now, especially in Worcester. Now we have five new bookstores.
How great.
It's amazing. Yeah. So the bigger books, the chain bookstores are now going out, a lot of them.
Yeah.
And the independent.
That's what's left here is independent bookstores.
Yeah. It's amazing.
The chains have kind of closed.
Yeah. Speaking of that, where can people find your books?
Well, I think that they could get sold through my website. I mean, you can write to people, but basically they're just in most bookstores at the moment. Some of the backlist is probably just available it's available on Amazon or something, other places like that, but you can always order them. They're all in print still. So you can order them from a bookstore that can get them for you, or go online and find them.
And a little plug here for people. You can always get them from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester. You can, and you can just send us an email at orders@anniesbooksworcester.com. And we can get all of your books. And if we don't have them now, we can always order them for you. Okay.
And that's been wonderful through the pandemic too, is that you can still get books even though you can't or you couldn't go into bookstores.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It's just amazing. And then my last question actually for you is, where can people follow your awesomeness?
Well, the honest truth is that I don't have a presence online, except my granddaughter has an Instagram something for me, which she does I think she's sort of pretending to be me. And I think she may have gotten bored with it. And maybe it's pretty much defunct now, but it wasn't for a while. I mean, I checked it out once. But anyway, I don't have my own Instagram, so I can't really look at it for very long, but that's it. That's my online presence. But she has some nice photographs of my dog, for instance, and of, I guess that's probably sort of it. It focuses a lot on my dog and my books, and then the people that are interested in that, which is.
So you do have a little furry critter.
Yeah, I do. Lovely.
Does your dog help you write?
Well, he likes to sleep when, he likes to get in the chair here and sleep, or he'll follow me around the house, but he's just wonderful. He's our last dog. We've had dogs and dogs and dogs all our lives together. And we actually did this sort of actuarial discussion. Now, listen, if if we get him, and we got him at about 3 or 4, he was a stray, but we were sort of figuring out whether we could still walk him if he lived to be like 14, how old we would be, and whether this would work at all. And we lined up people who said they would take him if we died before he did. It was also important. But we couldn't have lucked out more. He's just a funny, delightful dog, and we both just adore him.
What kind of dog is he?
He's pretty much, I think, a Cairn Terrier, which is sort of what we've had mostly, although their line is not exactly established, but they all look completely like Cairn Terrier, so I think they all were. territory.
Oh, great. Well, I'd like to thank you, Sue, for joining
This
us
has been
today.
very nice. Thank you so much. I hope it
Yeah,
isn't that the lagged thing isn't too awful.
now it's fine. It was
Oh,
fine
okay.
about 3/4 of the way through. It just
Kicked in.
kicked in. Yeah, it
Funny.
was very odd. Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's been fine for a little while. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe you can just excerpt that little bit and put it up or something.
I don't know. But thanks a lot for joining us today. And, we'll hope maybe after the pandemic, your next book, you could come and visit us at Annie's.
That would be great. I look
Okay.
forward to that. Okay, thank you so
Okay.
much for this. It was a lot of fun.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Bye-bye.